Revolution knows no compromise. Revolution overturns and destroys everything that gets in its way.
This is Breakthrough News, and you are watching The Freedom Side. I am one of your hosts, Eugene Puryear, here as always, alongside my intrepid co-host, Rania Khalek. Rania, as always, great to be back alongside you.
It is always a pleasure to be alongside you, Eugene Puryear.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that. And big shout out, of course, to all of our viewers out there. Happy to be back with you as well. And as I always do, I will take the time to remind those of you who are watching on YouTube that now would be a fantastic time, as good a time as any, for you to go ahead and hit the subscribe button. Make sure you hit the bell so that you get the alerts for the things that you subscribe to. And you want to make sure that you set notifications on, which can not always happen when you subscribe to something. So make sure that you are double checking when you hit that subscribe button, hitting that down arrow and making sure that you have your alerts on. We just don't want it to be very difficult for you to find the things you are looking for as it concerns all the great content we have coming out from Breakthrough News. And of course, for those of you who are watching on Free Speech TV, just a big shout out to you. And I only ask you continue to support Free Speech TV, and a big shout out to the FSTV team, as always, for making it possible for us to appear there as well. Rania, are there things you would like to relay to our viewers as we get started here?
Indeed, there are, Eugene. I want to remind people that they need, not in addition to liking, subscribing, and sharing this episode, it helps boost us in the algorithm, you can actually help Breakthrough News materially keep going and growing by becoming a patron at patreon.com/breakthrough news. For as little as $5 a month, you can access exclusive content as well as exclusive merch like my very cool and bright Breakthrough News mug. I'm just gonna turn that around and show off my nails because they look really good right now. That's right. But in addition to getting exclusive merch and accessing exclusive content, you will be helping independent media at a time when it's more important than ever that outlets like this exist to push back against the tsunami of corporate propaganda that's constantly being shoved down our throats, whether it's to lie about the floods that we're going to talk about today that swept across Texas and killed a lot of people, or lie us into war across the Middle East, which continues to escalate in the region I'm in, or just destroy the world so that a handful of people can profit, while all of us are forced to pay for it with higher taxes on the working class. So anyways, we're going to be talking about lots of issues today, but if you appreciate our content here, and also if you stick around to the end, you will get to see a sneak peek of my documentary about the Israeli pager attacks in Lebanon, which will be releasing tomorrow. We have a really fantastic teaser for you today. So stick around to the end for that. But we were able to make that documentary, and we'll hopefully be able to make many more because of support from our audience.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, I am certainly very much looking forward to it. So that's one of many reasons to stay till the end. But if you only needed one, then that should suffice. But I think people are going to really, really enjoy this documentary. And I think that it's groundbreaking in many ways, at least in the English language, to have the work you were able to do, Rania. So going to be a great day tomorrow, going to be a great day today. So a lot for you here. As Rania has already mentioned, we'll be going around the world as we always do. So many different things are happening right now. And we want to start with Syria, where, as you mentioned, Rania, there's been a significant uptick in violence and an expansion of conflict there. And Israel, of course, playing a central role in stoking the flames, so it seems. So we are very, very honored to be joined here on the show once again by Elijah Magnier, the veteran war correspondent. Elijah, as always, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Well, great to have you here. And I mean, it's there's so many facets to this. It's almost hard to know where to start. But I mean, I think the first one is, it appears to me that the the sort of broader Israeli strategy here, and perhaps maybe where it fits in with some of other things they've been doing around the region, is it seems to me to sort of partition Syria and to do everything they possibly can to keep those who may be against them in any way, shape, or form divided. But I wonder, how you're looking at the overall goal of Israel, which of course is claiming they're doing this bombing to protect the Druze people of Syria.
Well, I think the obvious strategy of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is to divide Syria. That is the easiest thing and the easiest positive outcome for him because Israel needs to expand. As Donald Trump said, it's a very tiny place and needs to be enlarged. And this is exactly what Benjamin Netanyahu is doing in Lebanon and in Syria. And what is odd for many people to see how Benjamin Netanyahu started to attack Syria when Bashar al-Assad fell and was removed from power, and then advancing the troop to occupy the Golan Heights, the Hermon, the Mount of Hermon, and then advancing toward the Suwayda. So today he's talking even about demilitarizing zone. So he doesn't want any of the Syrian troop to advance south of the capital, Damascus, toward the border. So we're talking about 75 kilometers long, where no military troop from the governments are allowed, according to the Israeli. We're talking about the Syrian sovereignty, Syrian territory. So for Israel, the best scenario is really to divide Syria, where he can take a large part of the south of Syria, and we're talking here about Daraa and Suwayda, and that will be a great opportunity for him for different reasons. First, it is the objective of the Likud party and the far right wing Israeli to enlarge Israel, to take part of Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, eventually on the long term. But also, if he manages to include Suwayda and Daraa, he will have at least 750,000 strong Druze population that can reinforce Israel's grip over the Golan Heights, offer a buffer zone to the northern frontier. So he has there around 25 to 30,000 settlers living in 30 settlement in the Syrian occupied Golan Heights. So he has occupied the Golan Heights, and this is where he sent the settlers to live in. And if he manages to include Suwayda, then he will have a good 10 to 20,000 men to be enrolled in his army, and he needs that for his expansionist objectives.
Elijah, I want to ask you about the Syrian side of things here, now that you've explained the Israeli goals. Because, obviously what we witnessed after clashes broke out between the Druze in Suwayda and the Bedouin tribes in Daraa, which has happened in the past, is Mohammed al-Jolani, Ahmed al-Shara, whatever you want to call him, seemed to use this as an opportunity to send his forces, his HTS forces, to carry out sectarian atrocities across Suwayda. And this comes after what we saw them do on the coast a few months ago. And I'm just a little confused of what the thinking was there, because did Jolani think that perhaps because the U.S. had lifted sanctions and he had said he was going to normalize with the Israelis, or was hinting that he would and showing signs of it, that maybe that meant he could do whatever he wanted? It made him feel emboldened, because it seems to have really backfired for him.
Yes and no, because first of all, he did not oppose the Israeli bombardment and destruction of all the Syrian military warehouses. Funny bit is when the Israelis would destroy dozens of military warehouses, missiles, navy, tanks, helicopters, the Syrian media and other media supporting Abu Muhammad al-Julani, Abu Ahmed al-Shara, the self-declared president, they would call it the remnant of the Bashar al-Assad regime weapons. Like, these weapons do no longer belong to the Syrian army. which is really gaslighting people to say, oh, this is not ours, so the Israeli can bomb them. So what the Syrian army was left with is light weapons. And light weapons is always a favorite of the Israelis to leave because that leads to a civil war. In Lebanon today, they are asking for the missiles and drone of Hezbollah. They don't want the light weapons. So it's the same scenario everywhere, and light weapons are a very good tool when countries can put people together for sectarian use or ethnic or whatever. Now, for Ahmed al-Shara, he said clearly that he is not an enemy of Israel. He met with Donald Trump in the presence of the Saudi Crown Prince. The Emiratis adopted him, the Qataris adopting him, and he said to the Americans, I'm all yours. In fact, the moment when the Israelis were bombing Sueda, the CIA was meeting with the Syrian intelligence in Damascus. So they were there, they have a full collaboration. Now, for Shara, he has taken his decision. He wants to have a peace deal with Israel only when the Saudis will walk in and will accept to normalize. Then he will join in with the other Gulf countries, because he can't go solo. He would be completely isolated by the Gulf countries. They will not accept that because they are the ones who are promoting him, and he can't go on his own because he needs their money. Now, for the Israelis, this is not a good scenario. They don't want anyone to be close to the Americans, but through Israel. Israel is not taking the role of a policeman, but taking the role of the master and the dominant of the Middle East. And for Ahmed al-Shara, even if the Israelis warned him not to cross south of Damascus with his army, he will abide by it, and he will not reject the Israeli order, but he will continue relying on the Gulf countries and the Americans to find a solution. And the reason why the Israelis did that is because the Shara said, I don't want an embassy in Damascus now. I would have an embassy only when all the Arab countries will join in the same objective and will all have an Israeli embassy. So for Israel, in this particular moment under Benjamin Netanyahu, he needs a war. He's stopping now the war in Gaza for a ceasefire, maybe starting with 60 days and can last. His chief of staff is Zamir is already saying we have achieved the objective. So he goes for another war against Syria. Now, he has declared that he has accepted the ceasefire with the Syrian when actually there is no ceasefire because he is the only one firing. The Syrians are not firing against him. In the meantime, he is gathering 3 divisions. We're talking about more or less 40,000 troops, 30 to 40,000 troops. So in addition to the division that exists in the Golan Heights, he's adding a reservist division, and he's bringing the Division 98 from Gaza to the Golan Heights. So his plan in the southern Syria is not over. And for him to take part of Syria and then negotiate a normalization of the relationship between Syria and Israel, that would be the best scenario for Benjamin Netanyahu to present himself to the Israeli citizens who are still after him for his corruption cases, etc. And he will just say, well, I have done a lot for Israel, so now it's time for you to pardon me and for me to call for the early elections.
Well, I mean, I also am curious because as we get closer to the UN General Assembly, there are rumors that Ahmed al-Shara and Netanyahu will be meeting on the sidelines. And then, here in Lebanon, Elijah, you've had Tom Barrack, who's actually the U.S. ambassador to Turkey, but has become a kind of like U.S. envoy to Syria. And now it seems Lebanon, he's taken over I don't know if you want to say Steve Witkoff role for the time being. And he's been talking about disarming Hezbollah, which you referenced before, and that the U.S. is essentially pushing for the Lebanese government to either disarm Hezbollah completely, and he even uses terminology like house to house, or I don't even know what the or is, or just like basically threatening full force. I'm not really sure. It's basically like the Israelis are in charge of policy. And then, so Lebanon has that going on from its south. And then there's Syria, where you have Ahmed al-Shara being very aggressive towards Lebanon. There's a lot of concerns now about Lebanese security in terms of Shara using his forces potentially to carry out terrorist attacks in Lebanon, which, you know, would just be blamed on like ISIS factions. And there have been a few foiled plots so far, which really just seems like state-sponsored terrorism here. And on top of that, you hear rumors, I don't know how true they were, that he was floating the idea of, you know, taking Tripoli, and that was something that Tom Barak referenced. And also he's pushing for the Syrian prisoners in Lebanon to be released. And when I say Syrian prisoners here, I mean people who have actually committed terrorist attacks in Lebanon. And not just Syrians, by the way, also rumors that he's pushing for the release of Ahmed al-Assir, the Lebanese extremist sheikh, I think he's a sheikh, who is basically responsible for the murder of many Lebanese soldiers in the past. But I'm just curious your thoughts on this, you know, sort of unofficial collaboration almost between the Israelis and Syrians now against the resistance in Lebanon.
Well, you mentioned many important points. So if I may, I would respond
Please.
to, yeah. So you mentioned the north of Lebanon. So Thomas Barak, the U.S. ambassador in Turkey and U.S. envoy to Syria and Lebanon, said that, well, actually Syria, the great Syria and the Levant can return and impose its control over the north of Lebanon, that is Tripoli and Akkar. Well, I think what he is threatening the resistance that Lebanon will start losing apart when these two areas count for 700,000 Sunni, and Hezbollah, I don't think, will regret if these will be no longer part of Lebanon, if the Americans want to threaten Hezbollah with these, and then the Shia would be the majority and they will still be the strongest, even more than before. But the problem are the Christian, because that will put the Takfiri, the extremists who are responsible for the massacre against the Druze and against the Alawite on the front line with the Christian in Lebanon. So if Akkar and Tripoli would go, then the next border is Junim, Ameltain, and all this area, and that will be the border of the Christian area. So basically what he's doing is frightening the Christian with his threat. Secondly, by saying Syria can invade Lebanon and take part of it, well, it's a more reason for the resistance to keep his weapons, because who's going to defend Lebanon if the Takfiri attack, in particular when the Lebanese army is not allowed to be equipped to defend itself by the Americans, and Hezbollah has already 10 years of experience fighting the Takfiri in Syria and Iraq and prevailing over them. Therefore, this is again a way for Hezbollah to say, well, thank you very much, Thomas Barak, you're giving more reason for us to exist. And the third point is, with all the flirting between Thomas Barak and Ahmed al-Shara and the Americans and the Syrian new leadership, lifting the sanctions, embracing the new Syrian regime, and then we see how the Israelis just move in, bomb Damascus, bomb the Ministry of Defense, the vicinity of the presidential palace, and then give a warning to the Syrian army that it cannot cross south of the capital, and the whole area after that for 75 kilometers is under the Israeli control. That is again another reason for the Lebanese to say, well, there is no actually a guarantor, because the Americans are part of the problem and not the solution. Therefore, all these menaces that are going on from the Americans on the Lebanese to impose on Hezbollah to deliver it missile and drone only, that is not working very well because in Lebanon, there are other priorities. Nobody's talking about the withdrawal of the Israelis from the occupied territory. And we're talking about the Ghajar, we're talking about Kfar Shuba Hills, the Sheba Farm, and we're talking about the 5 new hills that the Israelis occupy in the 2024 war. We're talking about the water in Wazani, where Lebanon is taking only 4 million cubic meters when it is allowed, according to the agreement, to take 43 million. We're talking about the violation of the Israelis of the airspace, the maritime and the land border between Lebanon and Israel, and nobody is stopping the Israeli. We're talking about the daily killing of the Israeli of Lebanese by air and drone without any intervention from the Americans. There are so many other priorities that the Lebanese have on their list prior the delivery of the Hezbollah weapons. So I don't think Hezbollah is going to move that way because there is nobody who can guarantee that Israel will respect the deal.
Well, a lot to keep following, a lot to keep watching. It's plot only seems to thicken. So as always, Elijah, we really appreciate you joining us here and helping us sort through it all on the freedom side.
Thank you very much for having me.
Mm-hmm. Rania?
Well, Eugene, as we speak, there seem to be clashes again taking place, and maybe clashes isn't the right word, but in Sweden with, anyways, Syria is a disaster. It's a mess. And I gotta say, like, I know I've said it on the show before, but a lot of us were warning of this. This is what this U.S. regime change scheme against Syria for over a decade was meant to do, was to create an unstable country where sectarian bloodshed is the norm. And that's always, being cut up into potential smaller and smaller ethnic statelets. That's really the Israeli and American dream for this region. And it's an absolute disaster. It's a horror show.
It is. It is. Well, we will perhaps return a little bit more to this topic towards the end of the show. And again, stick with us till the end of the show. We have a very important trailer for you for a great documentary that Rania has been working on for some time here about the pager attacks that took place in Lebanon, and really maybe more importantly, those who were victimized by those pager attacks. So stick with us through all of our great stories coming forward, but definitely stick on for that. Another major issue that we want to turn to now is well, I don't really know else how to describe it, the hunger-inducing policies of the Trump administration and the Republican Party that is about to start taking place due to the cuts that they have put into SNAP or food stamps. And we are very, very honored to be joined here on the show as we continue our conversation by Emma Jansen, who is a writing fellow at the American Prospect. Emma, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to talk about this.
Well, we are very happy to have you. And maybe just to start to give some context to people, because I think you see, people know they're cutting food assistance, but maybe give us a sense of the scale and the scope of the cuts in the so-called One Big Beautiful Bill to SNAP.
Yeah, absolutely. So first, I'll set up the scale of the SNAP program itself. 1 in 8 Americans receive SNAP. So they receive some amount of money per month to spend on food. And the Big Beautiful Bill, which was signed into law on Independence Day, is going to cut, I believe the final number was around 186 billion from SNAP. And those cuts are coming in a really wide variety of ways. It's not just that they're getting rid of that dollar amount. There are a lot of kind of pernicious policy tweaks that are going to eventually lead to that much money being cut. And estimates by, some think tanks and policy orgs say that up to like 20 million families or households could end up losing some of their benefits, whether that's, $25 a month or all of their benefits entirely. So it will be massive, and we can talk about this. It will also affect food banks. It will affect local grocery stores. So it's really a ripple effect.
There have been cuts to SNAP over the last several decades, actually under both parties to some degree. So, and I think that this is the case with like a lot of these sorts of cuts and tax breaks for the wealthy, right? So sometimes it's easy for people's eyes to glaze over because they're like, oh, that's just like what's been happening before is happening again. So I'm curious if you could talk a bit about how this is actually significantly worse than what we've seen take place before in terms of cuts to these programs.
Definitely. I mean, I think there are many different ways to start. I think there are so many elements of these cuts and the specific ways in which they're being done that make this different. So we're now seeing work requirements becoming a bigger issue with SNAP, and that's not a new thing. There have been work requirements in SNAP before, but it's now going to be harder for folks who are older, so like 55 to 64, they're going to have to work. Veterans are going to have to work. Parents of children who are in their teens are going to have to work. So, Republicans say that work requirements are good for the economy and they're good for the people who are receiving these social safety net benefits. But a lot of data is out there that shows that work requirements don't actually improve employment rates, and they just kick people off of programs when they can't meet that administrative barrier. I think something that is particularly devastating about these rounds of SNAP cuts is that they are coming in the context of so many other cuts. So I spoke to some food bank leaders in multiple different states. I've spoken to folks in Indiana, in Alabama, more, probably more than I'm forgetting. But they all say that, local farms, local food banks, anyone else working in food policy has probably already been affected by completely separate USDA cuts from the Trump administration. And so now, with the SNAP cuts that are going to really affect their communities that they serve, there's going to be this increased burden on those food banks that are already weaker than they would be. Then, of course, we have Medicaid cuts that are coming, which will hurt the health of tens of thousands of Americans, if not millions of Americans, right? And when people aren't able to see doctors for preventative care, it all connects with food, it all connects with health. So I think it's really a compounding of cuts that makes this particularly bad.
One aspect of this, I seems ridiculous that I'm even giving this time, but obviously Republicans are saying, well, all we're really doing is cutting like waste, fraud, and abuse, and we're just going after the slack in the program and so on and so forth. And I wonder, so it seems obviously that this is a lot of money for that to be waste, fraud, and abuse, but what do we actually know about that? I mean, how hollow a claim is it, or how much credence perhaps should we be giving it?
Mm-hmm. I think it's a pretty hollow claim, certainly as a justification to just completely slash this program. It's true that SNAP is an incredibly administratively difficult initiative. It's, billions of dollars given out to millions of Americans and administered by both the federal government and states to some extent. So there are a lot of wires that can get crossed, but really we see SNAP as being an incredibly effective program that delivers money to the people who need it the most. And, there have been many initiatives done by the USDA, which runs SNAP to get rid of waste and fraud. And they've been able to do that. And they've also found that it's not nearly as high as, like you mentioned, some Republicans would say it is. I would also point out that one of the new changes to SNAP is that some states are going to have to take on an increased cost sharing burden for paying for these benefits, when before the actual cost of food benefits was completely shouldered by the federal government. Now the federal government is looking at the percent error that states are making in either overpayments or underpayments, and the federal government is essentially charging states for for those errors. But there are a lot of issues with that system. That's going to be potentially devastating for poorer, more rural states like Alabama. I spoke to a lot of folks there about that. So, yeah, it's a good question. It's important to take seriously, but I think that once you do your research, you can find that it's not nearly as large to justify these levels of cuts.
Speaking of these levels of cuts and how they're not justified, I'm just curious, what's the media coverage been like on this? How has the media been accurately capturing the scale and severity of these cuts, or is it being buried in other headlines? And, the corporate media does have a tendency to kind of like side with the idea that, people are getting these benefits that shouldn't be, or it's being abused. That's been the case, at least in the past. So yeah, I'm just curious how you would assess the media coverage of all of this.
Definitely. That is a great question. I think that unfortunately, SNAP often gets overshadowed by other social safety net programs. So, like Medicaid, for example, in past decades, it would often be overshadowed by TANF. And to some extent, that's been a benefit for SNAP. It's kind of flown under the radar when a lot of political attacks were aimed instead at the more, politically targetable programs like TANF and Medicaid. But now, of course, we do want to see coverage of these issues. We want people to know what could be coming down on their lower income neighbors, or what could be coming down on them themselves. I think that information access is a really important part of this story for SNAP recipients. As these programs get changed and as states implement these work requirements for things like Medicaid and change the work requirements for programs like SNAP, there might be folks in really rural regions without great internet access, without laptops, who just have no idea that their enrollment status could be changing, who have no idea that there are more forms they need to complete to continue receiving money to buy food. And, if covering SNAP more can somehow help reach some of these people, or can at least reach those around them who can then reach them maybe in person, I think that's incredibly crucial, because there will be cases, I guarantee it, where people just don't know that they've missed something administrative and suddenly they don't have money to buy food.
I mean, it seems like such a crisis. And I mean, you already mentioned the issue of food banks. I mean, I was hoping you could maybe say a little bit more about that, because obviously if you lose your SNAP, that's what everyone is probably going to be looking for, is can I find some food bank and go to it? And I know they're also being hit, as you also mentioned, by the USDA cuts. So, I mean, how bleak is that situation looking?
I think it's pretty bleak. I have an article coming out, I believe next month, in the American Prospect, where I'm a writing fellow, that, focuses on SNAP in Indiana. And I won't spoil it too much, you should read it, but I spoke to some folks who run a food council, and they spend a lot of time as a go-between for food banks, for farmers, and for the people who use those food banks. And we're talking about some incredibly successful programs that were directly connecting farmers who are also struggling economically with food banks who could buy their goods and give fresh, healthy food to local school children, to folks who just need those food banks for economic reasons. And those programs in March were just completely slashed by the federal government, by USDA. So food banks are, I think, in a crisis mode right now. I don't want to speak for all food banks, but I have not spoken to a food advocate or a food bank executive or leader who is not a little bit terrified. They need to find some way to make up the food that they are already losing through separate grants, while also preparing for, in some places, thousands, tens of thousands more meals needed by the community. And briefly, another aspect to this story is the effects on grocery stores. In a lot of lower income communities, we already know that many are food deserts. There are like one or two stores, and they might not be great stores, not a lot of fresh produce, etc. But they're still where people go to get food. And some of these stores, like 80% of those who shop there get SNAP money, and they shop with their SNAP card. And if these people are suddenly kicked off of SNAP or have significantly less money to spend with SNAP, that is then money that otherwise would have been transferred to that small mom and pop store that suddenly is disappearing from that community. And then we see the food deserts worsening, because then we see the mom and pop stores unable to stay open, unable to have the same inventory. So there is the food bank aspect, but also this intertwined, local store aspect as well.
Wow. Well, we will definitely be looking for that article. We will be following your byline. Hopefully everyone here is following the American Prospect. Emma Jensen, thank you so much for joining us here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you. Take care.
Rania?
I mean, Eugene, it's just incredible how much money, and I know we say this and it's like kind of like cliche at this point, but the amount of money that gets spent on destroying the entire world. And then you've got people just like these billionaires in charge of literally the government that are just nickel and diming people. And I will say, my mother actually was on SNAP at some point, before I was born. But it helped her get by in a really dire moment when she had her first kid and both my parents didn't have jobs. So it literally helps people from becoming malnourished, especially children. And it's just disgusting. It shows you the priorities of this country.
Yeah, no, I think it actually, several years ago, the study came out. I think it does more than any other program to lift people out of poverty. So a lot there, a lot to be said there, a lot to continue to follow, and we will. We want to move forward to another critically important story, and that is the consequences of climate change, which have been, just very much in the forefront of many of our minds. Of course, the tragedy we saw in Texas and the floods that have also hit New Jersey as well. And we are very, very honored to be joined here by Aru Shiney-Ajay, who is the executive director of the Sunrise Movement, here to talk more about that. Aru, thank you so much for being with us.
Great to be on. Thank you.
Well, I want to actually just start with the issue of climate change, because, of course, whenever these individual incidents happen, there's always a lot of an attempt to not always, but by many, to downplay the impact of climate change. So we've seen that with the floods in Central Texas in particular, that it's just sort of things just sort of happen. And obviously there are people who are very invested in not linking this to climate change. So how much can we, if not this individual incident, but when we're seeing all this flooding and all these things, should we be linking it to the consequences of climate change?
We absolutely should. And I think something about climate science is that sometimes it can be hard to link every individual event. But if you look at it cumulatively, you see that over and over again, we see these once in 100 years, once in 1,000-year floods happening. Every few years, we see record-breaking heat waves, and that just ends up being exactly the effects of climate change that we would expect, like higher humidity, different, increased rainfall. These are the effects of rising temperatures, of changes in our global seaflow patterns. This is all about the fact that we have polluted the climate for decades, and we are seeing the results of it.
And of course, okay, so this is the part of this broader pattern of these super extreme weather events that are absolutely connected to climate change. And that's a huge part of the story. But another big part of it is this kind of failure to respond after the failure to stop or try to mitigate the worst effects of climate change. You also have federal climate agencies that are supposed to respond to disasters like this that have been gutted by, now Trump and DOGE, but actually previously in other ways as well. I mean, this is Texas we're talking about. So I guess what are the consequences of that kind of dismantling in moments like this?
I mean, I think you see the consequences. Right now, there are 134 people dead. I think dozens of those are children. This is a direct result of specifically I would say, Trump's cuts to the National Weather Service. If you look at what happened, a lot of the cuts, a lot of the vacancies that were in the National Weather Service in the area were of the people who would usually be in charge of communicating with local officials. And those jobs were not there because of Trump's cuts. And the result of that is that the National Weather Service did issue a lot of warnings, did issue a lot of communications, but just had less capacity to be able to communicate with local officials about the risks of these floods. And the result of that is lives lost. It's just that simple. And when you scale it up, when you look at what FEMA is able to do, what NOAA is able to do, what the National Weather Service is able to do, this is only 6 months in. These effects are going to get worse and worse as both the climate crisis gets worse and worse, and as we start to see the repercussions of totally slashing and defunding these agencies.
The other issue I want to ask you about is sort of how it seems like we're just getting further and further behind the 8 ball on addressing this. And in the context of the One Big Beautiful Bill, obviously one of the main things they were attacking were various programs around clean energy. I mean, I even saw in the context of some congressman was saying that part of the reason he was voting for it is they said they're going to find more things related to renewable and clean energy to cut in order to fund something he wanted. I forget exactly what it was. So obviously a big target. I mean, what's the real impact and the setback of those sorts of policies that are, I guess, now being enacted?
I think it's really dangerous. I mean, this bill is a lot of things. It's a waging war on working people in America. It's a giant handout to billionaires, and it's especially a handout to oil and gas billionaires in the oil and gas industry. And it also is the worst bill for climate that we have ever seen in American history. It totally slashes a lot of the progress that we made under the Biden administration, which was still far from where we needed to be, but was certainly strides forward. And it halts a lot of the renewable energy build out that's going to happen. It's going to kill around 800,000 green jobs. And all of that ends up in tangibly reducing our ability to curb emissions, right? And that is the central challenge of the climate movement right now. It's to bring down our emissions so that we can minimize the impact on our air, our water, our homes, this flooding, this fires that we see. If we don't curb our emissions, we're going to see more and more and more of them. So that is the impact that we're seeing. And certainly it increases the burden of what we're going to have to do if and when we have governing power again. It dramatically increases that. The other thing I'd say is that these are also just costs to everyday people. Like the amount of, it's easy to make this feel like an abstract concept about emissions or carbon. What this is that your home is more likely to flood. Your home is more likely to burn down. You're less likely to be able to afford food in the future because food prices will rise. This is really about giving fossil fuel billionaires money and subsidies in exchange for raising our energy costs, like stopping us from shifting to clean energy and making our lives worse.
I guess this is maybe my theme for today's live stream, but I gotta ask, how would you assess the media coverage of all of this? Because everything you're saying is so important to highlight, right? The impact of climate change and causing these extreme weather events, as well as the complete corruption of government, the negligence, the deregulation, the role of the fossil fuel industry in setting policy that makes it impossible to respond or even mitigate climate change. How has the media been covering this? Have they been highlighting what's responsible, or is it kind of, whitewashing a lot of that and just kind of, saying it's a tragedy?
I certainly think there hasn't been enough coverage of the fact that this is not just a tragedy. It's both a result of climate change and a result of Trump's decisions. I think Trump and Abbott have tried very hard to try and depoliticize this as much as possible. And I think a lot of the media has allowed them to do that, or sort of has, engaged in their frame. I think that's really dangerous. Like, what this is both this is a huge cost of what Trump's actions are. And also, I think it's like a weakness of Trump's administration, that the fact that these things are going to keep happening, and if we keep letting him off the hook, then everyday people don't get to see how his decisions are actually affecting them. So I definitely think it's the responsibility of the media to articulate that, and to also articulate that this is not a question of like, do we have the money to respond? It's a question of what our priorities are as a society. Like FEMA's budget is, I think, around $30 billion. We spend quadruple that in subsidies to oil and gas. What we are choosing to spend money on reflects on what we care about as a society, and that is something that we can actually change.
Mm-hmm. Well, I want to ask you a two-part question here, and leading in from the media, it's just making me think, for people who have Paramount Plus, they have this show Landman with Billy Bob Thornton, paid for by the American Petroleum Institute. But a big theme of a monologue in every single episode is that it's not actually possible to have enough renewable energy to like power our society. So I guess part one of my question is that even true? And I guess part two of that question is, given the sort of governmental dispensation right now, how important are mass movements in terms of how we can actually reach some of these goals?
Some of my favorite things to talk about. It's absolutely not true that renewable energy can't power our society. And I think if you look at the last few decades, what you see is that the fossil fuel industry has to come up with different lies every decade or so to try and delay progress. And at first, their number one lie was climate change isn't happening. And when the evidence for that started mounting up a lot, they switched to another lie, which is that it is about individual responsibility. Something not everyone knows is that British Petroleum actually invented the term carbon footprint in order to push responsibility onto individuals. So that was their next big propaganda campaign. And when that stopped working and people started pushing corporate responsibility, their new campaign is that it's too late and we can't do anything. And you can actually just see the eras of propaganda that they push. It changes its form, but it's always the same goal: to let them drill for oil and gas while screwing over the rest of us. So it's absolutely not true. Renewable energy absolutely can power us. They're trying to make it not by cutting renewable energy subsidies and making sure that we can't build renewable energy, but it could. It's growing really fast. It's cheap. It's affordable. It's more democratic than oil and gas are. It's better for consumers. So it's better in basically every way. But I think you're right. Like right now, the political situation that we're seeing is certainly not conducive to building out renewable energy. And I think that if you actually look at where people are, I think something like 94% of Americans support the federal government using its money to build out more solar panels. Like that is that's a huge percentage. There's enormous public support for this. And I think the job of mass movements is to be able to translate that passive public support into really active pressure that forces politicians to say that, okay, there's actually no other choice but to say yes to this. And that isn't going to happen by only talking about renewable energy. It's going to happen by talking about the wholesale reimagining of our society that we need to do. The reason people are voting for people like Trump is because they understand that society isn't working for them. They think Trump is a solution. And I think the responsibility of mass movements is to say, no, we can build something better. We can build a political and economic system that works for working people, where our homes can be safe for flooding, where instead of you having to pay for the impacts of your homes, impacts of climate disasters on your home, polluters have to pay. We can actually hold the billionaires responsible and also build a better world that works for all of us. I think that's what mass movements have to offer right now.
And that's super important to highlight. And I think for a lot of people, it just feels like such an insurmountable problem. Like, what can I do about it, right? Like, we're kind of told to just take shorter showers. But obviously, like, what has to happen is the movement building aspect of this. And there are people that are part of movements, but a lot of people don't know how to be. So I guess for all, to say for people who are watching this horror unfold, what can they do right now? Or what can they get involved in, I guess, to support climate justice and try to fight back?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing I'd say is like join an organization near you. Join Sunrise if you want to join Sunrise. It's sunrisemovement.org/join. It's that simple. Just type that in. You can find us on Instagram, on TikTok, on our website. It really does matter. At this point, we're already seeing the climate crisis hit our homes. The question of whether we can stop it and how we respond is going to be a question of how ordinary people choose to respond in this moment. So I know it's easy to feel like you can be powerless, like this problem is so big. The truth is that we have an incredible amount of power at our fingertips. And the fact that we are being told that nothing can be done is a lie of the fossil fuel industry, is something that they have deliberately pushed to be able to make money. So if you want to break out of that lie, join a movement, organize with people, whether it's organizing like direct aid in response to climate disasters, whether it's organizing protests at politicians or billionaires' houses, whether it's just helping your neighbors and talking to people and growing the movement and bringing people in. There's a role for everyone in this movement, and look us up and join us.
Mm-hmm. Right on. Well, I think the history of mass movements, they always say you can't do it, and the next thing you know, you have won. So we really appreciate you, really appreciate Sunrise and all the work you're doing. Aru Shiney-Ajay, the executive director of the Sunrise Movement, thanks so much for joining us here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you for having me.
Mm-hmm. Rania?
Well, Eugene, I gotta say, I mean, it was really awful to see this horrible flooding take hold and like all these kids die. Like it was just terrible. It's just completely horrific. And you see this every single time it happens. It's the same sort of bland conversation on CNN, which I know I watch it so that you don't have to. And they're not expressing the things we just talked about when they talk about what's happening in Texas.
Yeah, and we have to move on, but Greg Abbott, when they even asked him, and he made this just like bizarre football analogy when like the team loses, how teams that succeed don't point fingers, teams that they just talk about what can we do better. And I just thought to myself, like, what are you talking about? Like, I mean, yes, obviously anyone who's ever played a sport, you don't want to just like randomly be going after someone, but as someone who actually knows about football, which I assume Greg Abbott does too, Monday after they play in the NFL on Sunday and Tuesday, but especially Monday, they bring out the tape and they start looking at how they play and they start actually saying, what did we do wrong and how do we prevent that from happening next time? So even his like analogy to try to shift the blame was 100% wrong and 100% incorrect. They call this area Flash Flood Alley. So the fact that no one has done anything for years to try to mitigate this is really just stunning on multiple levels. But
that's a brilliant. That's all right. That's real quick. That's just like what a brilliant focus grouped, probably practiced attempt at deflection. What you just described. Yeah. That's pretty incredible. I missed that.
And he almost kind of fumbled it too. Like he was somewhat confused about how he was trying to explain it. So someone wrote that lineup for him and it didn't work. Because what can you say? It's obvious that they were responsible for not doing enough. More worried about, I guess, opening up charter schools and stuff in Texas, which they're spending billions on right now. But that's another story for another time. We want to move forward to another critically important story in the world, and that is the ongoing conflict in the eastern part of the Democratic Republic of Congo and surrounding nations as well. And we are very, very honored to be joined here by Claude Gadabuke, who is a survivor of the Rwandan genocide and the executive director and co-founder of the African Great Lakes Action Network. Claude, as always, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, Eugene and Rania. It's a great honor to be with you guys.
Well, it's an honor to have you with us as always. And I guess I just want to start with the situation on the ground, because the last show we had a couple weeks ago, we had Kambale on, who I know you know well. We were talking about the idea of the concept of this peace deal that the U.S. has brokered. But then I go yesterday to see what the news is on the ground, and I see that the fighting is continuing. Thousands of people have been displaced in different parts of Eastern DRC. So, I mean, how real is this peace deal? And I feel like we've heard this a million different times that some deal has been signed, but the fighting continues to grind on with this M23 offensive in various parts of DRC.
Your question about how real is the peace deal, I call it the minerals deal, because there is no peace without justice. And the deal that was signed does not have anything in reference to actually the people, the millions of people who have lost their lives as a result of the war of aggression and invasion by U.S. allies, Rwanda and Uganda, into Congo. There is no reference to the hundreds of thousands of women who were assaulted in brutal ways. Just rape being a weapon of war, being used as a weapon of war in this invasion of the Congo. There are no talks of even using U.S. laws. The U.S. has a number of laws that can be used to hold the belligerents, especially their own allies, accountable. There are laws against the use of child soldiers, which Rwanda and Uganda backed militias and proxies have used and still are using today in the Congo. There is a law, Public Law 109-456, which has actually a section that talks about what the US can do to folks who are destabilizing the Congo. And so the peace deal to me, and I'm referring it to the peace deal because that's what it's known as, for me it's the minerals deal, is a deal that is similar to if you have a pimp, because there is exploitation in all of this. What is built in is US access to critical minerals found in Congo. It's if you have a pimp and you have two of their workers fighting, or maybe one of them is fighting and they're fighting somebody, another person, and the pimp steps in and goes, you know what, stop it, stop fighting. The issue's not resolved. They're just saying stop fighting because they're using that power to push and say, stop all that fighting. But until there's a real solution to, number one, the question of holding accountable the perpetrators, until the people can actually return to the reason why the atrocities are so horrible is so that if you don't die in the atrocities that are taking place, and you survive but you are displaced, you never go back to the place because the fabric is torn, by the type of, just committing mass rapes in front of children, in front of of their parents, in front of the children. These are some of the horrific things that are happening, and I have sources actually within the Rwandan military who, some of them are afraid that they may have contracted HIV as a result of taking part in these mass rapes or rescuing the injured who are bleeding and who have taken part in some of these atrocities. There are many groups in the Congo that are committing these atrocities, but Rwandan troops and Ugandan troops have been have committed the most egregious, the most horrible atrocities. And today, you're asking about what's going on the ground. Yoweri Museveni, so Rwandan troops are led by Paul Kagame, Rwanda's president. The Ugandan troops are led by Yoweri Museveni, who both have been belligerents in the region since almost, more than 40 years ago, since the early 80s, in Uganda and then in Rwanda and now in Congo for the last 30 years. And you have Museveni's son tweeting out saying that if there is an outbreak of fighting in southern, in South Kivu, which is the southern part of Eastern Congo, that they will expand their area of control, which they are in the northern part of Congo. There is a tweet out there by Muhoozi Kainerugaba, who is a general in Uganda's military. He is the heir apparent to Yoweri Museveni. His military is part of the occupying forces of the Congo. And he's saying they will occupy more territory if there is fighting in southern Kivu. And there is, at least according to reports, there has been troop movements in parts of eastern Congo, both in North and South Kivu.
You just talked a bit about the various African countries that are involved. You mentioned Rwanda and Uganda and their complicity in this ongoing essential looting of the Congo. But this does often get framed to US audiences or to English-speaking audiences as solely an African conflict where Africans are just killing each other because, that's what happens on the continent of Africa. It's pretty much that blatant and racist. But I'm curious if you can talk a bit about the role, you mentioned it a little bit earlier, but specifically the role of Western governments and corporations tied to Western governments in sustaining and profiting from all of this killing.
I'm so glad you brought that up because it's a total injustice to frame it as an African on African crime, black on black crime, and that it's all just the local players. All the countries involved, especially Rwanda and Uganda, both are two of the poorest countries in the world. They cannot afford the type of weapons that they're using today. They don't have the type of budgets that it takes to wage these protracted wars. So they depend on the support of the U.S. U.S. is the biggest donor to Rwanda. They depend on Western support, military support, training, funding. Paul Kagame was actually trained in the U.S. at Fort Leavenworth as a Ugandan soldier before invading Rwanda and taking over Rwanda. And so, again, as you can understand, the training was actually training a Ugandan soldier who then turned out to be Rwandan, went to invade Rwanda, took over. And so there's training and there's funding. One of the most egregious example is a couple of years ago, there was a lot of noise, especially coming from European countries, denouncing the atrocities in Congo, denouncing the invasion of the Congo by Rwanda through its proxy, the M23, or rebranded, Rwandan troops rebranded as M23. And within the same period, the European Union gave Rwanda $20 million for, not for education, not for anything humanitarian, for the military. And they said that this was for Rwandan troops operations in Cabo Delgado in Southern Africa, in Mozambique. As if you give them $20 million, you can trace where all of that money is going. And of course, they were talking out of both sides of their mouths. On one hand, denouncing, and on the other hand, actually, they were doing more than talking out of both sides of their mouths, because they were giving out money that helps this military that's actually committing atrocities. People in Mozambique alone were protesting against Rwandan troops' occupation of Mozambique. And it's there, what these militaries are doing, they're serving as mercenaries of Western powers, the US, the UK, the European Union, France. They have, basically, these are armies for hire. Uganda's military are in the Congo to secure, in parts of Congo, to secure oil for French oil company Total. And then they're also working with multinational companies that are extracting, especially gold, out of Congo. And then Rwanda is occupying areas that are rich in coltan, which are also, they're in cahoots with Western multinationals that are extracting those resources and transporting them through Rwanda. So not only do they provide the mercenaries to go and displace the people and keep control of the area, but they also are providing routes for extraction, for smuggling, for stealing these resources and selling them on the global market. And so that is how the system is set up. You have, for me, I always use this analogy. It's similar to the transatlantic slave trade, where you had human beings being the merchandise. And they needed governments to legalize it, or to at least normalize it and allow it to happen. And corporations were involved in actually trading, doing the trade. It's a very similar thing. And people are, I mean, you have children working in the mines in the Congo as young as 10 and 11 and 12. So there are atrocious labor violations that are happening there anyway. But taking it back to the analogy, in the Congo, you have these mercenaries, the armies of Rwanda and Uganda, that go in there to occupy and provide access. You have the multinationals that are smuggling these resources out of the Congo, stealing them and selling them away from the continent, and the people in the Congo are starving. And then you have global governments, you have the UN, you have all of these entities that are just looking on, and either looking the other way, or giving a slap on the wrist, and at best, for most of the time, just playing lip service to what is actually happening as far as the harm to human life. Millions of people have died. I mean, Trump is talking about it now every day. It's like a talking point now. It's like millions, 7 million people have died. And then you have another more than 7 million people that have been displaced out of their villages. And because of the brutality of these atrocities, the people are not planning to go back until there is justice. And so it comes back to justice. But as I'm so glad, Rania, you asked that question, because this is a global issue. You have the global corporations, global governments, global power brokers, all involved in the exploitation of the Congo and all involved in the atrocities in the Congo. And I said this before, it's not just silence, it's not just support, it's an active role by the US, by the UN, by the UK, by the World Bank, by the UK, by the European Union, and a lot of their members. And so it's a global thing.
You know, in the last few minutes we have here, one thing I also just want to touch on is the sort of image of Rwanda in the world. And obviously, you know, we could have a whole segment and a whole show about that. But the idea that, you know, as DRC is a basket case and Rwanda is perfect, basically. And it's great governance. I think most people's perspective is super democratic, that there's no one in the country that disagrees with Kagame, and all these other sort of pieces there. And I know we can only briefly touch on it, but I was hoping you could speak to that aspect as well, because I think the reality is very different than what many people think it is.
Watch yourself, Eugene. The Rwandan government might accuse you of being a genocide denier, even though you didn't even mention anything about genocide. That's how they gaslight people. Anytime you talk about dissent or issues, and yes, everybody treats that government, that regime, as perfect. I mean, even the president, he wins elections. He assigns himself 99 I can't remember what, but over 99% of the vote in elections. And speaking of what is happening in Rwanda, I think what I could use is the repression, both internal and external, especially using genocide, invoking genocide that many members of the regime actually took part in, and using it as a way to repress people inside of the country. So you'll say anything. I was half joking when I said that, you know, be careful, because if you say that there's a pothole in the road, they'll accuse you of having genocide ideology, and you can go to prison for years, including genocide survivors and opposition members. Currently, the leader of the opposition, Ms. Victoire Ingabire, she's been arrested for weeks now. On unclear charges. She previously served 8 years in prison for challenging Paul Kagame in an election, but also for challenging that when the genocide happened in Rwanda, there were atrocities that were committed against Tutsi people and non-Tutsi people, including Hutus. And for that, they sentenced her to 15 years in prison. And then after 8 years, Kagame, Rwanda's dictator, pardoned her and released her. But now she's back in prison, and it's a scary thing, because on the day that she was so-called pardoned, there was an artist, a genocide survivor, who had also been imprisoned for years on accusations of genocide denial, for singing a song that actually talked about atrocities by this regime and members of this regime. And when they rearrested him, he was actually found dead in a prison cell days later. So there is fear, there is real fear. And I can go on and on. There are a few names that I would like to just mention without talking about their situations. Aimable Karasira, who was a professor, university professor, another genocide survivor, serving. He's not even been finished his trial since 2021. There is Ivan Idamange, there is Kuma Hassan, a journalist who made his platform available to the people to speak about issues in Rwanda. He's writing in prison in Rwanda. Theo Umubavu, and so many others. I just wanted to mention those names because People dying in custody in Rwanda is routine. People coming up missing is routine. I mean, millennials, the millennial generation, there is a study that shows that almost 600,000 of them in the year between 2005 and 2016, there was almost 600,000 of them that came up missing. Like nobody can account for those people, and that's usually either because of dissent or because the government is trying to control the population. And as I said, that's not in the 90s. That's in the 2005 to 2015. So there is a lot going on in Rwanda. Rwanda is by far not perfect. And then when you add to the atrocities they're committing in Congo, the occupation of the Congo, the occupation of Cabo Delgado in Mozambique, and the atrocities they've committed against the Mozambican people, the crimes committed in every part of the world where they've sent Rwandan troops, the mercenaries of the West, in those places as peacekeepers. In Darfur, there were atrocities by UN troops. In Haiti, where Rwandan troops were previously, there were atrocities by UN troops. In Central African Republic, in Mali. So it's just, there is like a trail of tears in all these parts that Rwandan troops find themselves in, but they are sponsored by Western governments. And we, as taxpayers, we're actually paying and sponsoring this type of terror against their own people. What's happening to Victoria and Ingabire today, and all those people I mentioned in Rwanda, what's happening in the Congo, and what's happening around the world as a result of this military being sponsored, supported, funded by our tax dollars.
Claude Garabuke, as always, thank you so much for joining us here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Rania? You're muted.
Gotta do it at least one time a show, at least one time. And it's so authentic too. Yeah, so authentic. Like it can't be a thing that happens on purpose. It has to be by accident every time. So I mean, name me a genocide the U.S. isn't involved in? That's a fun, difficult challenge.
Yeah, I'm going to have to sleep on that one. Let's move to one that they're definitely involved in, and that's the ongoing genocide being committed against the Palestinian people, especially in Gaza. And we are very, very honored to be joined once again by John Elmer, contributing editor at the Electronic Intifada. John, as always, thanks so much for being with us.
Thanks for having me again.
Well, great to have you. And I just want to start on this, and maybe you can help our listeners understand, because, I was scrolling through today and you see all these maps of where they're telling Palestinians to go and where you need to be in Gaza and this, that, and the third. And I mean, it seems to me that they're just sort of setting up a range of internment camps. Some are calling them in concentration camps, and that's the sort of new reality for people. Am I overdrawing the point at all, or how should we look at that?
No, that's exactly what they're doing. They have 3 concentration centers, one in Gaza, one in the middle camps area, and one in the south of Mawasi along the coast. And then they have Rafah, which they have completely erased, literally. It's just completely destroyed. And their fantasy is that they're going to push everybody down into Rafah, into a concentration camp. But I will say that they have had these fantasies before, and they go back decades, right? Like even back to the 90s, Itzhak Rabin said that he wished that he woke up one morning and Gaza had sunk into the sea. In the north, they said that they were going to ethnically cleanse the north during the general's plan last fall. And that didn't happen. And so it's what's happening in the south is it's horrific. The complete destruction of Rafah, and their fantasy is to push everybody down into that area and make a massive, like you say on your banner right there, concentration camp. And they tried to frame it different ways, right? Like they called it a camp, and then they said they were going to concentrate people there. And then, so they're just walking right into it. But the question is if they can achieve these goals, like these fantasies, if the population and the resistance is going to fight, it's not clear how possible these fantasies are. They take up our time to discuss, and they've been happening since the first days of the war, because the mass displacement notices came a few days into the war, driving people out of Gaza City, and telling them to go down into the south to Rafah, where they would be safe. They called it a safe zone. And then they moved through Gaza until they got to Rafah, and they completely destroyed Rafah and pushed people into the other camps. And so, that's Israel's only plan. They don't have a plan to defeat the resistance. They don't have a plan to end the war. They don't intend to end the war because they haven't achieved any of their goals in the war. Their own stated goals were very clear: return the captives through violence, defeat the Qassam brigades, collapse the government in Gaza, and make Gaza no longer a threat to Israel. And all of those things have failed. Starting from the last one, you have an entire generation of kids growing up watching in front of them, knowing that it's genocide or liberation on the table. So Gaza is always going to be a threat to Israel if it's going to be a genocidal, predatory state in the way that it is. And the population of Gaza knows that they're fighting for a national liberation struggle, and Israel wants to kill them all. And so they don't have a choice. There's not a wide debate of options within Palestinian political milieu about what they should do going forward. They just have to resist Israel's plans to carry out its long-time fantasies that the United States has allowed them to do and funded them and supported them through this entire thing. There's no way they could be fighting this war without American weapons shipments that arrive basically every single day by air and sea.
I mean, Palestinians really are fighting it not just against the Israeli army, but like you said, they are fighting against the most powerful empire in the history of the world. And obviously, they are outgunned. Obviously, there is a huge technological disadvantage. That said, like you mentioned, this has been a fantasy for a long time. It remains a fantasy. Israel has not succeeded. What Israel has excelled at is murdering children and civilians and starving them and all the things that Israel's doing that are just unbelievably cruel and, Nazi-like, committing this Holocaust in Gaza. But one thing I really appreciate about what you do, John, is you are able to really break down what Palestinians are doing in response, because, they might not have, AI technology the way that Israel does, but they aren't taking this lying down. Right? They're not going down without a fight. So what is the Palestinian resistance doing now, nearing 2 years of this ongoing genocide?
Well, when Israel went back to war, they said what they were going to do to Khan Yunis, which is the next largest city above Rafah, was that they were going to turn it into Rafah, and that they wanted to have the whole south be destroyed and erased, and the concentration camp would expand along that territory. And what happened was they moved into Khan Yunis in late May, and since then, there's been more than 200 qualitative resistance operations against Israeli military vehicles and troop positions, sniper operations, but hundreds of operations against their tanks and armored vehicles, their D9 bulldozers, and their excavators. The resistance in Khan Yunis has been remarkable. This is the second battle of Khan Yunis, because the first battle of Khan Yunis was December 2023 until the end of Ramadan 2024, or early April. And Israel went back 14 months later at the end of May 2025 and met with a wave of operations of the highest quality, using the weapons that the Palestinian resistance has been using throughout this entire war. They didn't run into a ragtag group of guerrillas. They ran into an organized army that has prepared for this battle for 20 years, that are using the unexploded bombs that Israel drops on Palestinian civilians because the massacres you read about are against civilians. The areas where the resistance is fighting has been cleared of civilians. They push the civilians out of the area through all of these maps that Eugene was talking about, and they clear the area, and then the resistance fights the Israeli military on the battlefield in their own communities. And in Khan Yunis, that's resulted in a soldier nearly getting captured the other day out of his excavator. The operation began in late May with fighters running up behind an armored personnel carrier that they had fired Yasin anti-tank missiles at, that had frozen the troop carrier because there was wounded soldiers inside. And the Israeli army admitted a few days later that it was the division commander who was inside that Namur troop carrier. And we have video of the fighters pressing the door locks, trying to get into the back of the troop carrier. So these are not just hit and run operations. These are significant qualitative military operations that have slowed Israel's fantasy of just running over and destroying Gaza.
No, I think that's an important point. And when you watch some of these videos, I mean, it's clear these are complex ambushes that are being set up with a lot of forethought in terms of how they're putting this forward, and certainly speak to that if you'd like. And I guess one other question, you've sort of alluded to this, that I think is also notable here is, I mean, everything above ground has been totally destroyed, it seems, in almost the entire Gaza Strip. There's constant bombing, constant destruction, all these other pieces. So it seems to me that some element of their ability to keep fighting, and I think this is an important topic of conversation in terms of like who quote unquote Hamas and the resistance fighters are, is that people have to be supporting them. I mean, it seems like Vietnam, like in that sense, where you drop the defoliants, you do all these other things, and somehow nothing stops the resistance because they're being supported by the people themselves who are, doing what they can to help them continue their operations. And it seems to me that has to be, some or very significant a sense of what's happening here in terms of how they've been able to keep fighting for but so long.
Absolutely. When people flee their houses, you see them leave behind notes to the resistance. Take anything you need, saluting them. The resistance fighters are heroes in society. You could say whatever you want about the government. People criticize every government in every state, but the resistance fighters of the Qassam brigades and the other factions, there's 10 others still fighting. They're heroes in their society, and they're fighting for liberation of their people, and they're supported by people, even when they're living in tent camps along the Mediterranean beaches where they are, where there's no infrastructure. There's no way to sustain life in the camps that people have been forced into. A large number of people have been forced into, particularly in the Mawasi camp, where there's something like 750,000 people just living tent on tent. But the resistance got into this battle ready to fight for a long time, ready to fight a war of attrition. And I think that's the thing that people didn't understand that the resistance was ready for. And October 7th looked like a one-off attack to people at the time. But the truth is we're now 650 days into this war, and you're seeing the resistance able to use the environment. They don't have jungles or mountains. They have tunnels, but they have also the rubble. They're using the rubble of these homes that Israel believes that when a home is destroyed, that it can't be used. But the fighters clearly use the rubble to their advantage. It's their own neighborhoods, so they can find their way around their neighborhoods, even though all the landmarks have been completely destroyed. And the Israeli military talks about how hard it is to fight when you don't know where anything is. There's no landmarks anymore. But the Palestinians have used that, the rubble of their communities to fight, and to fight successfully. Still, I mean, I've been on your program every few months saying essentially the same thing, that we don't see any signs of the resistance coming close to defeat or anything of that sort. In many ways, even American and Israeli intelligence estimates suggest that the fighting force is at least the same size as it was the day the war began. And once recruiting starts after the war, that will go up dramatically, which is why fighting in a place where half of the population are children is, like Rania said, cruel, but it's also stupid because these are a generation that's going to grow up with a will to fight for their homelands after what they've seen and after what they've lost and the price they've paid for liberation. They're not going to take anything except liberation.
I mean, I certainly hope not, and I think we have to keep our eye on that at the end of the day, because it doesn't speak to just Palestine. I think it speaks hopefully regionally, because it does seem like we are in an era, and it's because we are, where Israel has really demonstrated its capacity not just for cruelty, but the ability to have the West just continue to funnel all the most expensive weaponry into Israel so it can maintain hegemony over the entire region. And so I think it does start to feel across the region like, this is like Israel's era and we're all just kind of living in it. But that's not the case, in the sense that there will always be resistance to Israel, whether we're talking about Palestine or Lebanon. And we shouldn't even count Syria out, by the way, even though these days it seems like where's Syria headed? So I'm curious if you can speak to that regional aspect, John.
Yeah, but I think Israel could never imagine that they would be allowed to do what they are doing. I think if they had thought that they could do this, the war would have looked different. They believed that there was a time limit to this operation. If you look back to their statements early on in the war, they thought they had a few months because the world supported them, because they were so shocked by October 7th and they were fed with lies and atrocity propaganda that fueled that. So they believed that they had a longer timeline to fight this war than other wars, but they couldn't have dreamed that the entire West would support in every single way their genocidal and expansionist, predatory expansionist aims all over the region, that they could kill in half a dozen countries and just maraud across the region. Israelis didn't know that that was possible, and that the West was that committed to whatever they do. And now, because Israel understands that, you see what we've seen in the last months. I mean, they attack Lebanon in violation of the ceasefire virtually every single day, often multiple times a day. They attack Yemen, they attacked Iran, they attack Syria. I mean, they've been attacking Syria for years, but to swallow up the land that they have swallowed, particularly in the south, and to demilitarize the state, these are devastating consequences that have generational impacts when you demilitarize a state like Syria. So I don't think that Israel had any idea that they would be granted this free hand, and not just a free hand, but like a complete welfare state that just hands over like an allowance to them whenever they need it.
It's really actually completely insane. And no, I just wanted to just say one more thing before I forget, John, is also there's ongoing talks of, and we've heard this nonstop, so it just feels like a massive gaslight every time it happens, but there's ongoing talks of a potential coming truce. Now, I'm actually curious what your thoughts are on that. Again, for the millionth time, a potential truce.
I don't see it. I mean, Netanyahu said that he is not going to end the war until his objectives are reached. Hamas and Qassam and the Palestinian resistance factions are not going to surrender. Their principles have been the same for the whole time. They want the borders open. They want people to be moved back to their homes. They want aid to be delivered through the previous mechanism, through the United Nations, that gave them dignity and was an important pillar in their society. And they're not just going to sign away the one, sort of piece of leverage that they have, which is there's 20 Israeli soldiers, active duty combat soldiers, that are being held in Gaza. And Israel's not getting them back without a just solution to this war.
Mm-hmm. Well, John, you and the whole Electronic Intifada team are doing quite a bit to break all this down on a daily basis, and we really appreciate that. And as always, thank you for your time here on the Freedom Side.
Yeah, right back at you guys too. Thank you so much.
Rania?
John is doing amazing work over at the Electronic Intifada, and I hope everybody is checking out their live streams. They do these weekly regular live streams that are just constantly giving like the nitty-gritty details. And I appreciate John so much because he really stays focused on the military side of things too, because it's easy to forget that in the midst of this entire genocide, there continues to be people resisting it in military fashion, and that's going to be looked at by history books in awe.
Yeah, I mean, I think I actually guarantee you that every military staff college on the planet Earth right now is actually studying what the Palestinian resistance is doing, because I don't think anyone would have predicted they would have been able to not only last this long, but recruit more soldiers and continue to fight on a regular basis. I mean, that means ammunition, arms, training, and that they're all able to carry all this out, under a genocidal bombing in an extremely small area. I have no doubt in my mind that it's already being studied in a major way by every military out there for sure. Before we close, Rania, I know that there's something that we want to show here. We've been talking quite a bit about the issue of the documentary you've been working on the pager attacks in Lebanon. I don't know if there's anything you want to say to introduce the trailer.
Yes, I spent several months putting together this documentary that I think I've talked about on the show before about the Israeli pager attacks in Lebanon last September that kicked off the massive escalation across Lebanon by the Israelis that, led to the assassination of Hezbollah's entire senior leadership, including the Secretary General Hassan Nasrallah. But before that happened, there was these pager attacks that Israel, the Mossad, years and years ago had booby-trapped these pagers that were bought by Hezbollah leadership and kind of distributed throughout the community. And we have to understand, in Lebanon, Hezbollah is not just a military organization; it's actually also an elected political party. And so, like all political parties in Lebanon, it runs schools and hospitals and essentially just like infrastructure in its community, because that's the way that Lebanon works. And so pagers were distributed to both, fighters and civilians alike. And Israel booby-trapped them and blew them up all at once back in September of last year, on September 17th. And it literally blew up in people's faces, including children's faces, in the faces of civilians. And they are these people who were injured are disfigured, they're blind, they've had to undergo so many surgeries. And this disgusting attack of terrorism was celebrated in the media and by Western politicians as being something innovative and precise and something to be praised because the Israelis are just such geniuses or something. So I got to speak to some of the victims, including children, of these pager attacks, as well as an international law expert who we've had on the show before, Craig McIver. And I spent some time in South Lebanon to film this documentary in collaboration with a production house in Lebanon called Blue House Film, and obviously produced by Breakthrough News. And I'm really proud of what came out of this. And I hope it serves as a kind of historical record, especially in English, of what Israel did in Lebanon. And so we're going to show a teaser. It's not long, it's short, but it's just to give you an idea of what this documentary is about. We just released the teaser. The documentary will come out on the Breakthrough News YouTube channel tomorrow. So keep your eyes out for that. It's really, really, really important that you watch this documentary, because this was not just, a random act of Israeli terrorism in Lebanon. This set a new precedent for what we will see in future warfare. And it's really important that people see the impact on the ground of this attack.
صارت ترن بطريقة كتير قوية.
صرت اسمع الصوت بدا ينطي صفير كتير قوي.
كبس اوكي وفجرت فيه.
طاروا أصابيعي، عم بقول له لبيه مش عم شوف.
العظمة تبعت وشي كانت مبينة.
باللحظة الأولى قلت خلص خسرته لحسان، وكانت إصابته كتير قوية.
حسان أنا تشوهت.
The Israelis are the best.
I absolutely support that. In fact, if anything, I love it.
كانت البيجر بس ضيعها أنا روح أبرم عليها بين ألعاب بنات.
A child who was killed by an exploding pager is not the victim of collateral damage.
كل ما يقول لي دكتور عن عملية بقول له لا، لأن أول شيء بخاف.
Beep beep.
What's your response to that?
حري بهم أن يخجلوا من أنفسهم.
نحن أقوى وبيخافوا يحاربوا وجه لوجه.
نحن لا نهزم، وإن جرحنا نستثمر بجراحنا حتى ننتصر. الضحك نحن حنضحك بالأخير. هذا وعد الله.
Well, obviously a lot there.
There you have it. Yeah, I'm curious, Eugene, I think that's the first time you saw that. What did you think?
Well, I mean, it's the first time I saw it in a way, but I have seen some of the footage and some of the interviews. Yeah. So I think it's fantastic, but I already had a sense that it was going to be fantastic and interesting. And I think the stories of a lot of the people themselves are interesting, just who they are, which, as you said, is not who many people were portrayed. I think, especially the young people and what they have gone through and what they've had to go through. I think the clips in there of just, John Fetterman and all these other, washed people sort of celebrating it. It really is just unbelievable on so many different fronts. And I think that it's actually crucially important that people not only watch this, and again, it'll be coming out tomorrow, Friday, July 18th. So if somehow you're watching this after Friday, July 18th, it's already there. So make sure you go to our Breakthrough News YouTube page. But, don't just watch it, share it with somebody, because I do feel that this, right in the moment where it happened, everyone was talking about it, but they were talking about it in the context of like a breaking news story, that this thing happened. And also in the context of the war, which is like, here is this new development in this war, but not the real stories behind what took place, which was deliberately obscured to make it seem like it was only just, people involved in military action who were hurt. So I think it's very important and killed. Very important to spread this around so people have the opportunity to see what really happened and to hear from people themselves, and hopefully themselves to be informed by the fact. And I think we saw this towards the end, that this endless war of Israel against people in West Asia is just not. It's not going to end until there's justice. I mean, they want you to think that no matter how much that they mete out so much brutality that it'll just be over, but that's not the case. And in fact, it's only, I think making people more willing to fight for their right to have self-determination and sovereignty in their own region. So very much looking forward to seeing the whole thing, seeing it all put together in many different ways tomorrow, July 18th. I think it's going to be fantastic. So hopefully everyone can take a look and share it around.
Yeah, I second everything that Eugene said. And I just want to remind people that, we are able to produce stuff like this. And I mean, I could be mistaken, but I don't think that there's really been anything in English. There has been in Arabic, but not in English like this, that really dives deep into these pager attacks. And so I'm really proud that Breakthrough News was able to be the one to do that. And we're able to do that because of the support we receive from our audience. And we want to keep being able to dive deep into those kinds of stories. I mean, we just produced posted a documentary produced and just put together by Craig Birchfield, one of our excellent, just all around camera guys, video guys. I mean, Craig's sort of a jack of all trades, honestly, and it was excellent journalism on the alligator Alcatraz story, where he went down on the ground and talked to people in the area of Florida where this disgusting concentration camp is being built or has been built. And so we're able to do things like that. We're able to bring you this documentary about the pager attacks that had pretty good access, I would say, to people who were directly impacted, and other stories like it because of support from viewers like you. Oh my God, I sound like PBS, but it's true. So please do consider, if you aren't already, becoming a member of Breakthrough News by going to patreon.com/Breakthrough News. Even the smallest donations help. Bigger donations are even better. And it really does allow us to create and produce this. I feel very proud. I think it's one of the best things I've ever worked on, this documentary about the pager attacks, which you'll get to see tomorrow.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, I think that's very well taken. Shout out to all of our existing patrons and everything you have helped make possible. And again, tomorrow, Friday, July 18th. And if it's past July 18th, then just go right ahead. Make sure you follow our YouTube page that you can check out this fantastic documentary and all the stories that are contained within it. I think that will do it for us here today. But as always, big shout out to all of our viewers, all of our guests, whole Breakthrough News team for making it possible. For myself, Rania, Khalek, we will see you next time.
gets in its way.